Hello, my name is Jet Smith, and welcome back to my channel. I'm the head coach for speech and debate at Highland High School in Pocatello, Idaho, and this is part one of my new Essential Debate Skills series. This video is all about flowing, or how we take notes in debate, no matter what type of debate you do. So in this video, we're going to talk about the basics of what flowing is and how to do it. Then we'll talk about the rules of flowing and how to make sure that you're doing a good job, before finally discussing flowing across the different debate events in terms of what it looks like and how it changes no matter what type of debate you are doing. So first up, what is flowing? Well, flowing is a specialized way of taking notes used in speech and debate activities. It's how we keep track of arguments that are happening in the debate round, and it's an organization tool for speaking notes in debate. So it simultaneously helps us know what's happening and what we are supposed to say and what our opponents have said and what they haven't said. So here are some examples, they're blurry, but of what flows in a debate might look like. Essentially speaking, think of the flow like the board in a board game or like a chessboard. And each column going up and down represents one of the speeches in the debate. And each sheet of paper is either for one side's argument or one of the major argument on a side. And anytime that argument is attacked, in a speech after the first speech that it is made, you write the attacks down next to the argument that's attacking. So you can see that there is a response in red to an argument in black, and then there are responses to that response in black as well. If you bring something up from an earlier speech that doesn't get responded to, you might draw an arrow to bring it forward. But you also kind of want to think of arguments in a debate like a relay race. And so anything that you want the judges to listen to in the last speech has to be extended from speech to speech to speech. And so if you drop it in the beginning of the round, you can't pick it back up at the end of the round. So how do you flow in terms of what do you need to flow? Well, you need at least 2 sheets of paper for every debate round that you're in. You need 2 different colors of pens, one for each team. So when the pro or the affirmative or the proposition side makes an argument, you will flow what they say in one color. And when the opposition, the con, or the negative team makes an argument, you'll flow that in your other color. You also need the 6 rules of flowing that I'm going to teach you in just a second. But in terms of the basics of how to structure your flow, what are you writing down? You are writing down the arguments, which includes the claims, the warrants, the data, and the evidence that your opponents are saying. So really, anytime they make an argument in the debate, you need to write it down, because if an argument isn't responded to, then it is considered true. And if you don't write down an argument, it's pretty hard to attack that argument. Again, each speech basically gets its own column, and you will write down the attacks that you are making or that your opponents made next to the thing that they are attacking. One important thing to know is that we don't flow cross-examination or crossfire because it's not a speech. You can write questions on your flow if you have extra space, or you can star things that you want to ask a question about, but a cross-examination period is not a speech, so it does not get its own column. Another good thing to do is, before you go into a debate, pre-flow your team's first speech in the first column of one of your pieces of paper. So that way, if you are a first speaker, you don't have to try and write down your speech after you give it, because you can't write it down while you're talking, whereas everybody else is writing down your speech. So especially for first speakers, it's important. But even second speakers and third speakers, if you're doing world schools, it's a good idea to have your partner's case pre-flowed, because it means that while they're giving it, you don't have to be listening and writing it down. You can be preparing arguments against what the other team has or will say. So how do we set up our papers? Here's an example from LD. I strongly would prefer and urge that you flow with your paper oriented vertically or up and down, not horizontally. So the paper should be tall, not long sideways. This is because whenever you add a new argument to the flow, you are adding the new argument downwards and not sideways. So if you write down somebody's first argument, then you're going to leave about 2 fingers worth of space going down in that column, and then you're going to write down a new argument. So because you flow going downwards in the speech, you don't need more space side to side in each column. You need more space going down in each column. Having a thicker column doesn't really help you. You're not going to put 2 different arguments side by side. You'll only ever put an argument and its attacks and defenses side by side. I've also seen that when students flow sideways, they are too tempted to write more than is necessary. They're less likely to follow the rules of flowing. So please flow with your paper oriented vertically, not horizontally, to help avoid running out of room. Now, another thing that there's disagreement on, but I'm less kind of strict about, is how you keep track of your columns. Now, some people will fold their paper to create the number of columns that they need. That's how I typically teach novices to do it, because until you've debated for a long time, it's hard to just know how much space each column should need. Or if you'd rather your papers still be able to lie flat, then you can draw your lines to create the number of columns you need. And you should have one column for each speech in the debate that is going to talk about the arguments on this paper. But when you get experienced enough, you might not need to draw lines because you just know how much space you have. So if you look at the example I posted a picture of on the right, you can see they didn't really draw any lines, but their columns are still pretty even. So now that we know the basics of how to set up our paper, let's learn the 6 rules of flowing. Rule number 1 is to leave lots of space between arguments in the same speech. So why do we do this? Because it helps us not run out of room for responses. So remember, in the next column over, that's where your opponents, when they attack your arguments, you will write down the attacks. But if all of your arguments are super close together and they make like 5 responses to each of your points, then you will run out of room to write down each of those responses. They'll get all mixed up and it will be hard to be organized. So my rule of thumb, if you have really big fingers, maybe you only need 1. If you have really small fingers, maybe you need 3. But in general, I would try to leave 2 fingers worth of space between each major argument or claim that you are going to need to respond to, or each major claim or argument in your case. So you can see an example on the right-hand side of this slide. Rule number 2, flow in all capital letters. Now, this is tricky because it's not what we're used to, but the reason why we want to flow in capital letters instead of lowercase letters is because with practice, it's actually faster because there are fewer curves, there are fewer intricate lines. The capital letters are simpler to draw. It's also easier to read through bad handwriting. And sometimes when you're flowing, even if you have good handwriting, you're writing things down so quickly that your penmanship slips a little bit. Or younger generations just seem to be getting worse and worse and worse at handwriting because we're focusing more on digital stuff. So you can instead do handwriting this way in capitals and it will be easier to read. So always write in all capital letters, try it, practice it, work on it, and eventually it will become natural. Pretty simple, just don't use lowercase letters. Rule number 3 is to flow small. Flow small. You don't want huge handwriting or you're going to run out of space. Also, the bigger your handwriting, the longer it takes you to write each letter. And so if your handwriting is smaller, you will save space and save time. Just use less ink and have smaller strokes with the pen. Rule number 4 is to flow without using unnecessary vowels and unnecessary words. So you can see that I've even started doing that on the slide. But when you don't use the vowels or the words that are unnecessary to getting the meaning of an argument, then you are going to save time because you're writing down fewer characters, and you're going to save space because you are writing down fewer characters. So instead of writing down unnecessary spelled all the way, I cut out any less letter that was unnecessary to understanding what that word is saying. If you look at the example flow, I don't really need the letter O in dogs to know that that word is for dogs, or the A in the word bark to know that that word stands for bark. So just skip letters that are not totally necessary. At the beginning, you might need more letters because you have less practice doing this, but eventually you won't need very many letters per word to know what word you wrote down. Rule number 5 is to flow using abbreviations. Abbreviations. So the reason why is, once again, because it's faster and it uses less space. This is especially good on topics where you're going to be writing down the same word over and over again, usually whatever word the topic is about. So in an example debate, like I have examples of on the screen here, between, if the topic is dogs are cute, if the topic is dogs are better than cats, instead of writing the word dog, I can just write the letter D, or the letter D with a circle. Or instead of writing the word cats, I can just write the letter C, or a C with a circle on it. Basically shorten really long words and find acronyms if you need to for really long phrases on the topic. So, for example, if you were debating about criminal justice reform, you could shorten criminal justice reform to just CJR to save time on your flow. And the final rule of flowing is to flow using symbols. This is because, once again, it's faster and it uses less space. So you can use a symbol when it's obvious, like anytime you're talking about money, use a dollar sign, right? If something is increasing or decreasing, you can use arrows going up or down. If you're saying that one thing causes another thing, you could use arrows going left or right. Or if you're trying to say something is the same as something else or different than something else, you could use an equal sign or an equal sign with a line through it. But you can replace words like equal, better, or worse with a greater than or less than sign. Basically, anytime that you can use a symbol instead of a word, use the symbol because it will save you time and it will save you space. So here are two example flows, one that uses the rules of flowing and one that doesn't use the rules of flowing. You can see that the one on the left is still okay because at least it's keeping track of stuff, but a lot more room has been taken up and there's a lot more written down, even though it's the same amount of information as the side on the right. That means that this person had to spend more time writing and less time thinking and preparing. It also means that if this debate was more complicated and there were more than two attacks against any argument, that they probably would have run out of room. So here are some examples or pictures of examples that are using these rules of flowing. And as you can see, these people didn't draw or fold their columns, but that's because they're more experienced and they're leaving space between their arguments. They're writing down attacks next to what was attacked. They're switching colors whenever one team is giving a speech versus, the other team is giving the speech. So these are good examples of flows because they follow the rules. I think the one on the left could probably save a little bit more room or space between arguments. Now, for flowing, blank copy paper is fine. We don't really want to use a legal pad or lined notebook paper because you will write bigger and feel like you need to stay inside of those lines instead of the lines of the columns, which is more important. The best paper for flowing is legal sized paper or bigger because it guarantees that you're probably not going to run out of room going downwards, even in longer debate types where the first speech end might be 8 minutes long. So I would prefer legal paper and just keep that paper oriented vertically, not horizontally. So now we're going to talk about how to flow in each type of debate. So if you don't do a certain type of debate that I'm talking about, feel free to skip ahead. I'll have chapters so that you should be able to click around pretty easily. But we'll go through each of the major high school types of debate and how to flow them using the techniques that I've told you today. We'll start with policy debate because it is the oldest and most well-known format of debate, most likely at this point. In policy debate, instead of flowing each side on its own sheet of paper, you flow each major argument that appears in a first speech on its own piece of paper. That usually means each stock issue or each contention gets its own piece. So if you were flowing the affirmative side's first speech, there should be a paper for framework if they have one. There should be a paper for each advantage. And maybe there should be a piece of paper for each of their stock issues if they're reading like a HIPS case. So a piece of paper for harms, a piece of paper for inherency, and a piece of paper for plan or solvency. Whereas on the negative side, you want a piece of paper for each off-case argument. So one sheet of paper for each disadvantage, for each topicality shell, for each counterplan, and for each critique. Maybe if you are debating against like one off-case argument where it's going to take a ton of time in the round and it's a complicated argument like a critique, you put each part of the critique on its own piece of paper, like a piece of paper for the links, a piece of paper for the impact, a piece of paper for the alternative, a piece of paper for framework. But that's pretty rare. But point being, in a policy debate, because each major argument represents something that the affirmative has to win in order to win the round, we really want to make sure that we can keep track of them directly. And because policy debate is so long, it's 8 speeches, and the first 4 are 8 minutes and the last 4 are 5 minutes, which is over twice as long as some other formats of debate. We really want to make sure that we can catch everything and not miss anything or run out of room. So in a debate where the affirmative has a framework and 2 advantages, and the negative read 2 disadvantages, a counterplan, and a topicality argument, That is 7 major arguments, and therefore you would need 7 sheets of paper. This is helpful for creating your roadmap and staying organized, though, because when you go up to give the speech, you just put your pieces of paper in the order that you are going to talk about them. Another thing that makes policy debate different from other formats in terms of flowing is the fact that you don't talk about every argument in the order that it was presented necessarily. You talk about it in order of its threat level or its importance to you winning the round. And so being able to rearrange your sheets of paper is really nice versus if all of the affirmatives arguments are on one piece of paper, it's harder to jump around and rearrange them. So here's an example of what your flows might look like if you draw the columns and label the top of each piece of paper with what the speech is in policy debate. There are 8 speeches, but the fourth and the fifth speech are the negative block, the second negative constructive, and first negative rebuttal. So it's basically one gigantic neg speech, and therefore it only needs one column, especially because those 2 speeches aren't going to, or at least shouldn't, talk about the same arguments like repeating each other. So this means that if there are 7 speeches technically in a policy debate, then there are 7 that would talk about the affirmatives arguments beginning in the first affirmative constructive. So any piece of paper that the affirmatives arguments go on, whether it's an advantage, framework, harms, inherency, solvency, needs 7 columns. Whereas any negative arguments that they start talking about for the first time in the first negative constructive, so disadvantages, topicality, theory if the negative reads it, critiques, counterplans, all of those would need 6 columns because the negative block is basically one speech and the first affirmative constructive won't talk about those points because they haven't been made yet. So essentially in a policy debate, every time it's a piece of paper for an affirmative argument, it needs 7 columns, and every time it is a negative argument, it needs 6 columns. Now, the affirmative or negative could read a new theory argument in their second constructive speech, or a new advantage or new disadvantage in the second speech, in which case they would need fewer columns. But in that case, you probably only need like 5 or 6. So now we'll talk about flowing in Lincoln Douglas debate, which also works in IPDA debate or Parley debate in college because of the number of speeches. IPDA is basically LD but shorter speeches, and Parley has 6 speeches, but 2 of the speeches of the negative are right next to each other. So it's basically 5 speeches. So you can flow Parley the same way that you flow LD or IPDA. Now, depending on the style of these debate events that you're doing, you might want to flow differently. If you are doing a more progressive or a policy debate style of Lincoln Douglas debate, you probably want to flow each contention or each main argument on its own sheet of paper. So if the affirmative has framework and 2 advantages, then you would flow that affirmative constructive on 3 different sheets of paper, 1 for each point. Whereas if the negative has a disadvantage, a counterplan, a theory argument, and a critique, you would flow each of those on its own sheet of paper. So you would flow the negative constructive on 4 sheets. If you're doing more traditional or lay Lincoln Douglas debate, then I would say flow each side's case on its own sheet of paper. So put the affirmative's case, maybe its framing and definitely its contentions, on one sheet of paper in the first column, and flow the negative's case, maybe its framework and definitely its contentions, on its own sheet of paper in the first column. However, I personally recommend that you flow Lincoln Douglas debate on 3 sheets of paper when you're debating traditionally. I would say that you put both teams' framework on one piece of paper, and then you put the affirmatives' contentions and all of the attacks and defenses about it on another, and then all the negatives' contentions and the attacks and defenses about it on another. That's because we want to be able to group framework to talk about it all at once so we don't get confused and so we don't waste a ton of time on it because of how short the speeches are in Lincoln Douglas debate. So here's what your flows would look like in Lincoln Douglas debate if you were doing the more traditional philosophy or, style of LD. You'd have 2 or 3 sheets. If you choose to flow framework on a separate one, you'd have 3 sheets of paper. Otherwise, you'd have 2. If you're doing the more, progressive style of Lincoln Douglas debate, then each affirmative paper would have 5 columns. Each negative paper would have 4 columns. But because there are 5 speeches beginning and ending with the affirmative, we've got the affirmative constructive, the negative constructive, the first affirmative rebuttal, the negative rebuttal, and the second affirmative rebuttal. This is kind of what your papers would look like. There are only 4 speeches that talk about the negative side because the affirmative can't attack what hasn't been said yet in their first speech. So the affirmative constructive does not need to be on the negatives piece of paper, hence why there's 1 fewer column. And if you choose to flow framework on a separate sheet of paper, it should also have 5 columns because it will pop up in all 5 speeches. Now let's talk about flowing in public forum debate, but also flowing in big questions debate because they have the same number of speeches and the same overall structure. The first option for flowing public forum debate that is commonly used is flowing each side's case on its own sheet of paper. So you'd flow the first speaking team's case and all of the attacks and defenses about those arguments on the first column of one of your sheets of paper, and then you'd flow the second speaking team's case and all of the attacks and defenses about those arguments on another sheet of paper. Now, this is pretty common and typical, and it's probably definitely the best for your flow judges and for your progressive judges and your technical judges. However, there's another way of flowing public forum debate that still involves two sheets of paper that might be better for lay and communications judges if you practice it. And that would be to flow the first half of the debate, the constructive and rebuttal speeches, which are the cases and the initial refutation and defense, on one sheet of paper. And then when you get to the second half of the debate with the summary, including defense, crystallization, and weighing, and the final focus speech, which is weighing and voters, maybe you want to flow those last four speeches on its own sheet of paper. The reason is because that way, if you want to restructure the debate into points of crystallization or clashes or main ideas in the summary, rather than going line by line, flowing this that way will allow you to be more persuasive and simple, and it will be easier to follow for a judge who isn't flowing. Because in public forum debate, even though you are flowing, you might get judges who don't flow or who don't know how to flow, or their version of flowing is taking notes in a bullet pointed list on a grocery store shopping list. So here's what your papers would be set up like if you choose to do the first option where you flow each team's case on its own sheet of paper. There are 8 speeches in public forum, and a coin flip determines if you flip first or second. So unlike in other types of debate, you are not guaranteed to speak first if you're the pro. If you're doing big questions, the affirmative will always be the first speaker. But the second speaking team does not attack during their first speech, which is rare compared to other types of debate, which means that because the second speaking team doesn't attack during their first speech, the first speaking team doesn't have to defend during their rebuttal. They have no attacks to answer yet. However, the second speaking team does have to defend in their rebuttal speech. So that means that there are 7 speeches that will talk about the second speaking team's case, every single speech except the first team's constructive. But there are only 6 speeches that will talk about the first speaking team's case, because the second speaking team's case won't, and the first speaking team's rebuttal doesn't need to defend themselves because there is nothing to defend. So a piece of paper for the second speaking team would have 7 columns, and the piece of paper for the first speaking team would have 6 columns. Now, if you're doing big questions, the affirmative paper would have 6 columns, the negative paper would have 7 columns. So the second option for flowing public forum or big questions debate that is friendlier to more lay or maybe traditional or communications-based judges would be flowing the first half of the round on one piece of paper and the second half of the round on another piece of paper. So once again, remember that the second speaking team does not attack during their constructive. Therefore, the first speaking team does not defend during their rebuttal. However, the second speaking team has to do both. They have to defend and attack. So that's why the first half of the debate, even though it only has 4 speeches, would have 5 columns. Because as you can see, the second speaking team's rebuttal has 2 jobs. They have to attack the first speaking team constructive and attack the attacks of the first speaking team's rebuttal. Whereas every other speech has 1 job. First speaking team constructive, read your case. Second speaking team constructive, read your case. First speaking team rebuttal, just attack. So then you'd have a second piece of paper for flowing the summaries and the final focuses, because that speech may restructure the debate into 3 to 5 main issues or clashes that people have been going back and forth on. And so you want the opportunity to be able to have a new piece of paper to see the debate in a new light. Now let's talk about flowing world schools debate. Flowing world schools debate, I'd always recommend flowing on 3 sheets of paper. I suppose if you are not going to do clashes in the third speech, which I would never recommend, then you might only need 2. But world schools speeches are very long. There's 56 minutes worth of speeches from 6 8-minute constructives and 2 4-minute replies. So you need a lot of space, and 2 sheets of paper, especially if they're not legal, probably won't be big enough. But when you are flowing in world schools, you should have 3 sheets of paper. The first sheet of paper should have 4 columns on it, and that is for the proposition team's case. So you'll flow the first proposition speaker's framework and their first 2 substantive arguments for their team on the first column of that sheet of paper, but you'll want to leave about a quarter of it at the bottom blank, or if it's not, legal sized, or if it's not a huge piece of paper and there's not enough room for that, you could just flip over to the backside, because in world schools, you read a third new argument as part of a team's case in their second speech. So you want to leave enough room at the bottom of the flow that you can add that in their second speech. If there's not enough room, then just flip over to the back side of the paper and flow the third substantive argument there in their second speeches column. But if there's not enough room for that, or if you forget, then just do it on the first side. And then every time somebody attacks the framing or those first 2 substantive arguments or that third substantive argument, you just flow those attacks and defenses to the right. Second sheet of paper is pretty much the exact same, but you only need 3 columns because the proposition doesn't talk about the opposition in their first speech. So you'd flow the first opposition's first 2 substantives on the first column of the second piece of paper, right? You don't really flow their framing there because their framing is an answer to the proposition's framing, so you'd flow those as attacks on the first piece of paper. But again, you want to leave about a third of the paper blank at the bottom so that you can flow the third substantive argument in the, last column for the opposition team's case. And then anytime those arguments are attacked or refuted or defended, then you'd flow those to the right. Then our third sheet of paper is what we use in the back half of the debate. So we flow the third constructive speeches with their clashes or their crystallizing questions and the reply speeches to voting issues or voting lenses on the final sheet of paper. So this is what it would look like. You'd have 3 sheets of paper. The first 2 are for the first half of the debate. The second one is for the last half of the debate. Now, if you are doing British parliamentary debate or college's version of world schools, then you'd basically just add 2 columns to the first 2 pieces of paper. So you'd need 6 columns for the government team and 5 columns for the opposition team. And then on the third sheet of paper, you would flip the proposition reply and the opposition reply columns. But essentially speaking, the first 2 pieces of paper are for the main substantive arguments and debate over those. And then the third sheet of paper is for the part of the debate that is restructured into clashes. Now let's talk about flowing in Congress, which I think is a really underrated and difficult to teach skill. And I think part of the reason Congress gets a rap for not being debate is because people don't know how to flow it, because it's not as logical or as simple as the other events, because you don't know how many speeches there are going to be, and there are so many speeches, and the speeches are so short, and they don't talk about every argument, so there's not really such a thing as dropping things. So if you just had a new column for each speech, then it would be kind of a waste of space, and you'd run out of room really quickly. So instead, in Congress, I say every time that there is a new piece of legislation, you should take out 2 new sheets of paper. The first piece of paper is for the affirmative side's arguments and all of the attacks and defenses on them. The second piece of paper is for the negative side of the House's arguments and all of the attacks and defenses on them. But no matter which paper you're using, this is what the columns are for, because each paper should have 6 columns. Column 1 is for constructive arguments, new reasons to pass the legislation on the affirmative paper or new reasons to fail the legislation on the negative paper. So anytime that somebody makes a new argument that hasn't been said before, you would write it, leave a finger or 2 worth of space in that first column and then write it down. In the second column, you want to write down the last names of the speakers who have made each of these constructive arguments. So instead of writing the attack down in the second column that somebody makes, write down just the name of each person who makes the argument or extends the argument or repeats the argument. Basically, anybody who's on this side of the debate and is agreeing with these points, you want to write down their names next to the point, because then later on in the round, if you attack those points, you can be like, Senators Smith, Johnston, and Mary have all argued that blah, 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 blah. And so it sounds really good when you can name all of the people who have made that point. The third column is where you're going to switch colors, because this is where you're going to write down your refutation. So if this is the affirmative piece of paper, then this is what you would say to attack the affirmative's arguments if you speak on the negative. So write down your ideas for attacks. However, in Congress, you don't know guaranteed when you're going to speak. And so sometimes other speakers might come up and make the attacks that you wanted to make. So if somebody comes up and makes the attack that you wanted to make, then cross it out. Don't fully scratch it out. You should still be able to read it, but just draw a line through it so that you don't make somebody else's attack and kind of steal it, because we want to be original. We want to add new things to the debate. So the fourth column is for also that other side that you were just writing refutation on. Write down the attacks that other people make. So let's say that this is the affirmative piece of paper. Column 1 is for all of the new affirmative arguments. Column 2 is for everybody who makes those affirmative arguments. Column 3 is how you would attack the point if you spoke on the negative. Column 4 is what other people actually on the negative do say with their attacks. You also want to write down, after you write down an attack, the last name of the person who wrote the attack, and that's because you might defend that point and answer those attacks later on. So for the fifth column, this is where you'd switch back over to the side that this paper is for. So if this is the affirmative paper, you're back in your affirmative color. If other speakers answer the attacks of negative speakers here, then you would write down their defenses and the names of the people who made those defenses. And the sixth and final column serves two purposes, essentially. If you choose to speak on the side that the main arguments in the first column are about, then you could defend the points that have been attacked in this column. So if this is the affirmative paper, you could write your affirmative defenses in column 6. Or let's say that you are giving like the 9th or onwards speech on the bill. All of the new arguments have been made, all of the most obvious attacks and defenses have been made. So you want to give a crystallization speech that breaks the debate down to its like 2 to 4 most important issues. No matter what side you're on, whether it's the affirmative or the negative, you can use this 6th column to write down your points of crystallization to make sure that you are bringing up like stuff from across the debate on this piece of legislation. So in a nutshell, first column is for, let's say that it's the affirmative paper. Column 1, new affirmative arguments. Column 2, who said those affirmative arguments. Column 3, what would your negative attacks be? Column 4, what were other people's negative side attacks? Column 5, what were other people's affirmative side defenses to those attacks? And column 6, what would be your affirmative defenses to those things, making sure you don't repeat what other people have already said, or your aff or neg crystallization, whatever side you decide to speak on. So that might sound really complicated, but here's what it would look like visually. You have 2 sheets of paper with 6 columns each. Anytime you hear a new affirmative argument, it goes on that first column of the left sheet of paper. Anytime you hear a new negative argument, it goes on the first column of the right side piece of paper. Then you write down the names of people who said those points in the second column. You write down your ideas for attacks on the opposing side in that third column. Then on the fourth column, that's what other people who get to give speeches before or after you make of attacks of their own, making sure you don't repeat their attacks. Then in the fifth column, it's for other speakers who defend against other speakers' attacks. And then in the last column, you write your defenses of that side or your crystallization of that side. Lastly, let's talk about flowing an extemp debate. This will be pretty quick. Basically, you need 2 sheets of paper. It's a really short type of debate. You're going to have 1 sheet of paper for the affirmatives case and arguments about it, and on the other sheet of paper, the negatives case and arguments about it. This type of debate is really short, and it only has 3 speeches for each side, and they're each only 2 minutes long. The first 2 speeches are just giving a case. The affirmative's second speech, or the first affirmative rebuttal, is only attacking because it has nothing to defend. Their points haven't been attacked yet. So that means the negative's first rebuttal has to defend and attack. It's kind of like big questions or like public forum if the pro was speaking first and you got rid of the final focus or the rationale speeches. This means that the affirmative doesn't get a chance to defend their own case until their very last speech, which is the second to last speech of the round. And so the negative then has to answer their defenses for the very first time in the very last speech. So it'd be like if a public forum debate, like I said, ended after the summary. So that means that you just need 2 fewer columns of paper on each sheet of paper. So the affirmative needs 4 columns for their case, and the attacks and defenses, the negative needs 5 columns. So here is an example of what it would look like if you were flowing in extemp debate. Now let's talk about how to practice flowing, because this is a huge, important skill. The first way to practice, and the best way, is to find debates on YouTube or on speechanddebate.org and flow them. Find a round that is 1 step above your skill level, right? You don't want to watch a debate between people who are worse at debating than you. So watch a debate that is slightly above your pay grade and act as a judge that is flowing the round. Then at the end of the round, it's especially good if there's an RFD, or a verbal reason for decision, or if you can find the ballots online for why the judges voted the way they did, because you can write your own ballot. And then after you write yours, look at the ballots of the judges and see if you picked up on everything they did, if they agreed with you and things like that. Also, you should take notes in school, in your debate classes, and just in life using flowing techniques. You will become so much faster at taking notes. You won't be that kid who has to tell the teacher to go back a slide, or everyone's waiting on them to finish the notes so that we can move on to the next slide. Another good way is to do a practice debate and have someone judge your practice debate. And at the end of the practice, compare your flow to the judge's flow to see if you picked up on everything or if they picked up on everything. And if they missed something, then that tells you you didn't repeat it enough or you weren't clear enough on it. And if you missed something, maybe that tells you you need to be paying more attention. Another good way to practice flowing if you struggle with it is to do a no evidence practice debate if you're doing a type of debate that normally has evidence. So this doesn't really help if you do world schools or IPDA because you don't have your evidence like pulled up with you. But essentially, do a practice debate where after the first two speeches, you can't use any evidence. So you have to rely entirely on the flow as your speaking notes and as to keep you organized. Because if you tend to be really like evidence heavy, you're spending the whole time that your opponent is speaking looking for cards and arranging your speak docs instead of flowing, then you're going to miss a lot of things. And this will help you correct for that. And lastly, it sounds weird, but doing a no flows allowed practice debates and seeing how differently you debate or how differently the judge receives it or how much you can and can't keep track of things when you're not writing anything down will kind of explain to you and teach you or your students the importance of flowing. So here are my final thoughts on flowing. Here are some of my just keep in mind this for best practices. Number one, always save your flows from tournaments. Always save your flows. Because you want to bring your flows back and then be able to prepare against what the team said. So if you are debating against people on a prepared topic in, public forum or Lincoln Douglas debate, or even in Congress or in big questions or in policy, you want to be able to have a record of what they said so that you can write blocks and brainstorm it with your teammates later. You can also give your flows from around to your teammates if they end up debating those same people so that they can kind of analyze and study them to be prepared for the future. You also need to write legibly. Your handwriting needs to be readable so that your partners and your teammates can read your flows, especially if you're in an event like Public Forum or British Parliamentary or World Schools or Policy or anything with a teammate. If your teammate misses something, they might need to use your flow or read your flow. And if your handwriting is terrible to the point where they can't read it, then that will get in the way. Even if you do LD or IPDA or Congress or Big Question solo, you still want to be able to flow legibly so that if you give your flows to a teammate who's about to debate that same person, or if you need to pull them back out once the tournament is over and read them to talk about the arguments you saw with your teammates, you might not even be able to read your own handwriting if it's been long enough since the debate happened. So you've got to write legibly. Additionally, always flow your opponent's last speech, even if you have already given your last speech personally, or if your teammates or your whole side is done giving speeches, still flow their last speech so that you have a record of what the judge's flow most likely looked like. And so that you can be thinking about, okay, did I properly, close all of the doors and all of the opportunities for them to win? If you don't give the last speech, but you didn't flow the last speech, and then you come out of round and you're like, how did we lose? I have no idea how we lost. We should have won. I'm going to be like, okay, well, what did the flow look like after their last speech? And if you can't answer that question, then you don't really know how the debate ended. So just because you're done speaking does not mean you're done flowing. Even if you're just the first speaker, so you're like, oh, I'm done, only my partner has a speech left, you need to keep flowing in case your partner misses something. You also need to remember not to neglect the flow to look for blocks or evidence. You can look for blocks and evidence on prep time, but you cannot flow what your opponent said out loud, verbally, analytics on prep time, even if they're sending speech docs. Remember, if you are not giving the speech happening right now, you should be flowing, no matter who is saying it. The only exception to this would be like the first negative in policy debate doesn't need to flow the second negative constructive because they're prepping the first negative rebuttal and they talk about completely different arguments. But otherwise, you should always be flowing. And you won't need to flow your partner's first speech if you pre-flow it like we talked about before. Have the first column of your team's piece of paper filled out before you even get to the round, and then you can spend that first speech, if you're not the one giving it, prepping for your rebuttal speeches rather than having to write down what your partner is saying. You should also consider double flowing for your partner when it's applicable. Like if you're on the negative in policy debate, or if you have a flex case, you might not know what case you're going to read until after you hear your opponents, in which case they won't have a copy of the speech preflowed. So while your partner is up there talking, you can flow a copy for yourself and a copy for them. So just have two sheets of paper lined up right next to each other with their first columns and make two copies of their speech. And that way, when your partner sits down, they have a flow. Remember, at the end of the day, flowing is the most important skill in debate. It puts a ceiling on how good you can be. If you are bad at flowing, you will not be able to reach the highest levels of being good at debate. With that being said, I hope that this was helpful for teaching you how to flow. This is part one of my Essential Debate Skills series. In the future, there will be videos about how to make arguments, how to cut cards, how to do cross-examination, and all of those types of things. So if there's a certain debate skill that could apply no matter what type of debate you do that you would like to see me do a video on, please leave a comment below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so that I can keep making more like it. But I appreciate you watching, and I will see you next time.